The first light of dawn is a liar. It promises warmth, but delivers a blade of cold that cuts to the bone. For the man huddled by the dying embers, it promised only another day of gnawing hunger and the long shadow of his past. He didn't know that this dawn was different. He didn't know that the choice he'd made 12 hours ago in the churning, icy fury of the whispering serpent river had sealed his fate. And he didn't know that the low-growing rumble shaking the very ground beneath him wasn't thunder. It was the sound of 100 horses, 100 warriors, and they were coming for him. Jedediah Stone was a ghost, haunting the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Dakota Territory. The year was 1876, a decade since the cannons had fallen silent at Appomattox, but the war still raged behind his eyes. It echoed in the hollow space where a soul was supposed to be a space carved out by the things he'd done and the men he'd lost in the muddy fields of Virginia. He was a tall man, made taller by the gauntness of his frame. His clothes a threadbare Union jacket, stripped of its insignia, and buckskin trousers, worn slick with use, hung from his bones like a scarecrow's rags. A pale scar, a souvenir from a Confederate bayonet, cut a jagged line from his temple to his jaw, pulling one side of his mouth into a permanent, weary grimace. His eyes, the color of a washed-out winter sky, held a profound and unsettling stillness. They had seen too much to be easily stirred. He'd come west not for gold or land, but for silence. He'd hoped the sheer, crushing emptiness of the plains would be loud enough to drown out the memories. For a time, it had worked. The daily struggle for survival was a brutal but effective distraction. The burn of an empty stomach, the ache of muscles pushed beyond their limit, the biting wind that felt like it was trying to peel the skin from his face. These were real, immediate things. They left little room for the phantom screams and the smell of gunpowder that haunted his nights. His only companions were a weary, long-suffering mule named Beatrice and the worn Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. The gun was a tool, nothing more. He hadn't fired it in anger since the war and prayed he never would again. Violence, he had learned, was a fire that consumed the one who wielded it long after the target was gone. For 3 days, he'd been following the erratic course of the Whispering Serpent River, a tributary that snaked its way through the sacred Pahasapa, the Black Hills. He knew it was Lakota land. The treaty at Fort Laramie, 8 years prior, had declared it so. But prospectors driven by Custer's reports of gold were already starting to trickle in, poisoning the well of peace. Jedediah wanted no part of it. He was just passing through a wraith on the landscape, hoping to go unnoticed. His destination was nowhere in particular. He was simply moving away from everywhere he had been. His camp was a meager affair, barely a disruption in the natural tapestry of the land. A small fire pit, a bedroll laid under the sparse cover of a cottonwood grove, and a small canvas tarp stretched to break the wind. He'd eaten the last of his hardtack yesterday, and the squirrel he'd managed to trap was a distant, unsatisfying memory. Hunger was a constant companion, a dull ache that sharpened the senses. It made the air smell of pine and damp earth, made the rustle of every leaf sound like a potential meal or a potential threat. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, Jedediah sat cleaning his knife, the rhythmic scrape of whetstone on steel a meditative sound in the growing twilight. He wasn't thinking of the past or the future. He was simply existing suspended in the moment, a man reduced to his most basic functions: breathe, wait, survive. He looked out at the river. It was swollen and angry from the late spring melt-up in the high country. The water, normally a placid, meandering stream, was now a churning brown torrent, filled with debris and treacherous undercurrents. It hissed and roared, a living thing with a malevolent temper. He had crossed dozens of rivers just like it, but this one felt different. It felt hungry. It was a premonition he couldn't shake, a cold knot tightening in the pit of his already empty stomach. He told himself it was just the fatigue, the hunger playing tricks on his mind. He was wrong. The river was waiting, and the day was not yet over. The sound that broke the evening's calm was not one of nature. It was the high, sharp cry of a child's terror, followed by a frantic shout in a language Jedediah didn't understand, but whose meaning was universal. He was on his feet in an instant, the knife forgotten on the ground, his body moving before his mind had fully processed the sound. He scrambled up the short, rocky embankment that separated his camp from the river, his heart pounding a sudden, violent rhythm against his ribs. Downstream, perhaps 100 yards away, he saw them. 2 young native boys, no older than 10 or 12. They were on the opposite bank, near a treacherous-looking outcrop of wet, mossy rocks. One boy, the younger of the 2, was in the water, his small body being tossed about by the current, as if he were a piece of driftwood. His arms thrashed wildly, his head bobbing in and out of the churning water. The older boy was on the rocks, one leg extended precariously, his hand stretched out, screaming words of panic and encouragement that were swallowed by the river's roar. Jedediah didn't hesitate. There was no calculation, no weighing of risks. The hollow man, the ghost who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, was gone. In his place was the soldier, the man trained to react to, move towards the sound of the guns. Or in this case, the sound of a child's drowning screams. He kicked off his worn boots and plunged into the frigid water. The shock of the cold was breathtaking, a physical blow that drove the air from his lungs and set every nerve ending on fire. The current immediately seized him, its power far greater than he had anticipated. It was a solid muscular force, pulling him downstream, trying to drag him under. He fought it, his lean, wiry muscles straining as he angled himself across the channel, keeping his eyes locked on the desperate, flailing form of the younger boy. Debris, a heavy log, a tangle of branches shot past him. The river was a chaotic battlefield. He could see the older boy on the bank, now running along the rocks, his face a mask of terror, his movements clumsy with panic. He slipped his knee, cracking hard against the stone, but scrambled up again, his eyes never leaving his brother. Jedediah reached the boy just as his head went under, for what felt like the 3rd time. He grabbed a handful of the boy's dark, wet hair and pulled his face above the surface. The child sputtered, coughed up a lungful of river water, and latched onto Jedediah with the frantic, unthinking strength of pure terror. His small arms and legs wrapped around Jedediah's torso, threatening to pull them both under. "Easy, son, easy." Jedediah grunted the words torn from his throat. "I've got you." But now they were in the main channel, where the river's fury was at its peak. They were being swept downstream at an alarming speed. Jedediah tried to swim for the bank, but it was like trying to swim up a waterfall. The boy's weight and the force of the current were too much. He saw the older boy stumble and fall into the water from the slippery rocks, his desperate attempt to help, only adding a second victim to the river's maw. Jedediah's mind raced. He couldn't save them both like this. He saw a large, partially submerged cottonwood tree lodged against a small island of rock 50 yards downstream. It was their only chance. "Hold on!" he yelled, though he doubted either boy could understand his words. He shifted his grip on the younger boy, hooking an arm under his chest, and used his free arm and legs to propel them towards the snag. Every muscle screamed in protest. His lungs burned. The cold was sinking deep into his bones, a deadly lethargy creeping into his limbs. He thought of the icy creeks in Virginia, of boys younger than these crying for their mothers as they bled out in the mud. The memory gave him a surge of desperate, angry strength. Not again. Not this time. He slammed into the log with a force that nearly broke his ribs. The impact knocked the wind out of him, but he held on, gasping for air. He shoved the younger boy onto the relative safety of the log, then turned his eyes, scanning the churning water, for the other. He saw him. The older boy was struggling, his strokes weak and uncoordinated. He was tiring fast. Jedediah pushed off the log. "Stay there!" he commanded the first boy, pointing a shaking finger. He swam the 10 feet to the second boy, grabbing him by the back of his leather shirt, just as the current was about to pull him under and into the main channel once more. This boy was heavier, and the fight had taken its toll on Jedediah. His movements were sluggish. His vision was starting to tunnel. Dragging the second boy back to the log was the hardest thing he had ever done. He felt his grip slipping, his strength failing. For a terrifying second, he believed he would fail, that the river would claim them all. But then the boy, seeing his brother safe, found a last reservoir of strength and kicked, helping Jedediah propel them the final few feet. With a final guttural roar of effort, Jedediah shoved the second boy onto the log. He tried to pull himself up, but his arms gave out. He hung there, his chest heaving, his body numb and shivering violently. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he managed to hook one leg over the rough bark and haul his exhausted body out of the water. He lay there for a long time, the three of them shivering and gasping for breath on the makeshift raft, stranded in the middle of the raging, indifferent river. They were alive. But as the last of the daylight faded and the vast cold darkness of the prairie night descended, Jedediah knew their ordeal was far from over. The island of rock the log was wedged against was no bigger than a large wagon, a miserable, wind-swept perch in the middle of the roaring river. Darkness was falling fast, and with it came a deeper, more penetrating cold. The wind picked up, whistling over the water, carrying a damp chill that seemed to seep directly into their marrow. The two boys huddled together, their bodies racked with violent shivers. Their dark eyes, wide with shock and fear, were fixed on Jedediah. He was a strange and terrifying figure to them, a white man, a Wasatchu with a scarred face and haunted eyes, who had just appeared out of nowhere and pulled them from a watery grave. They didn't know if he was a savior or a captor. Jedediah pushed himself into a sitting position, his own body trembling uncontrollably. Every joint ached, and the gash on his side from where he'd hit the log was throbbing with a dull, persistent pain. He looked at the boys. The younger one, his face pale and lips tinged with blue, had started to cry silently, tears tracking clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. The older one put a protective arm around his brother, trying to project an image of bravery that was betrayed by the trembling of his own chin. Survival instincts honed by years of war and hardship took over. Staying here was a death sentence. Hypothermia would claim them before morning. He scanned the river. The current was still a monster, but it seemed slightly less ferocious on the near side, his side of the small island. His camp was maybe 200 yards upstream. It was a desperate, foolish gamble, but it was the only one they had. He got their attention with a gesture. He pointed to himself, then to them, and then made a swimming motion towards the bank they had come from. The older boy's eyes widened further. He shook his head, a small, terrified motion, and pulled his brother closer. Jedediah knew words were useless. He had to show them. He needed their trust, or at least their compliance. He offered a hand palm up, a gesture he hoped was universal, for peace. He tried to soften his expression, to erase the hard lines etched there by years of pain, but it felt like trying to smooth a rock. He pointed to the far bank. then made a shivering motion, chattering his teeth. Then he pointed to his camp, though it was invisible in the gloom, and made a motion of a crackling fire. Cold here, warmth there. The older boy seemed to understand the meaning, if not the intent. He hesitated, his gaze flickering between Jedediah's face and the dark, swirling water. He whispered something to his brother in their own tongue. The younger boy just buried his face in his brother's shoulder. Jedediah knew he couldn't force them. He also knew they would die if they stayed. He made a decision. He would take the younger, weaker one first. He pointed at the little one, then at his own back, then towards the shore. He would carry him. The older boy seemed to understand this too. A silent, desperate negotiation was taking place between them, a conversation carried on through gestures and the shared language of survival. The boy looked at his brother, then back at Jedediah, his young face a mask of conflict. Finally, with a look of profound reluctance, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. Getting the younger boy on his back was an ordeal. The child was weak and terrified, but he clung on. Jedediah slipped back into the icy water, the shock less severe this time, his body already numb. "I'll be back for you," he said to the older boy, meeting his gaze and trying to pour every ounce of sincerity he possessed into those 5 words. "I promise." The swim to the bank was a nightmare. The boy's weight was a terrible burden, and the current still tugged and pulled, trying to spin them around, to drag them back into its clutches. Jedediah swam with a grim, mechanical determination, his arms and legs moving in a rhythm that was more memory than conscious thought. He kept his head up, his eyes fixed on the dark line of the shore. He wasn't just swimming for his own life now. He was swimming for 3. When his feet finally touched the muddy bottom, a wave of relief, so powerful it was physically sickening, washed over him. He staggered out of the water, the boy still clinging to his back, and collapsed onto the muddy bank, his lungs heaving. He gently lowered the boy to the ground, then turned, and without a moment's rest, plunged back into the river. The second trip was harder. His body was screaming in protest now. The cold had robbed him of his remaining strength. But the image of the older boy waiting alone on that rock, trusting a strange enemy to keep his word, pushed him onward. He reached the island, his movements slow and clumsy. The boy didn't hesitate this time. He helped Jedediah, his small, cold hands, grabbing Jedediah's arm to steady him. They made it to shore together, half swimming, half crawling the last few feet. They lay on the bank beside the younger brother, a heap of shivering, exhausted misery. But they were on solid ground. They were alive. Jedediah forced himself to his feet. "Come on!" He rasped, his voice raw. He helped the boys up. They were unsteady, their legs weak. He put an arm around each of them, and together the 3 of them stumbled the last 100 yards through the darkness to the meager sanctuary of his camp. The fire was little more than a pile of glowing red embers, but it was the most beautiful sight Jedediah had ever seen. The small fire was their universe, a tiny pocket of warmth and flickering orange light in an ocean of cold and darkness. Jedediah worked with an urgent, focused efficiency, his mind shutting out the pain and exhaustion. He piled on the last of his dry wood, coaxing the embers back to life, until a proper blaze crackled and spit, throwing dancing shadows against the surrounding trees. He stripped the boys of their soaked leather clothes, his movements brisk but not unkind. They flinched at his touch, but didn't resist, too cold and exhausted to protest. Their skin was pale and mottled their teeth, chattering like castanets. He wrapped them both in his single threadbare wool blanket, a threadbare patched thing that smelled of wood smoke and horse, but it was dry. He sat them as close to the fire as was safe, their small bodies huddled together under the wool. His own clothes were soaked, and the wind cut through them like a knife. He ignored his own discomfort. The boys were the priority. He rummaged through his saddlebags, his numb fingers fumbling with the buckles. He found what he was looking for, a small dented tin pot and a cloth pouch containing a handful of dried herbs yarrow and willow bark things he'd learned to gather for tea. It wasn't much, but it would be warm. As he set the pot of river water to boil, he glanced at his patients. The shivering was starting to subside as the fire's heat sank into their bones. The older boy, Chaitan, as Jedediah would later learn his name, watched him with an unblinking, analytical stare. He was assessing the stranger, his fear slowly being replaced by a wary curiosity. The younger one, Wamni, had his eyes closed, his small frame leaning heavily against his brother, drifting in and out of a restless, exhausted sleep. Jedediah knew the danger wasn't over. The cold could settle deep inside a sickness that could take a child. He had to keep them warm, get something warm inside them. When the water boiled, he steeped the herbs and poured the weak, bitter tea into his single tin cup. He knelt before the older boy and offered it to him. Chaitan stared at the cup, then at Jedediah's face. Trust was a fragile alien thing between their two peoples. A cup from a white man could be a gift, or it could be poison. Jedediah understood the hesitation. He held the boy's gaze, then lifted the cup to his own lips and took a sip. It was bitter and tasted of leaves and river water, but it was hot. He held it out again. This time Chaitan took it. His small hands trembled as he held the cup, and he carefully gave the first sip to his younger brother, rousing him gently. Wamni drank, then Chaitan drank the rest. A silent understanding had passed between them, an act of trust given and received. As the night deepened, a storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. The wind howled through the cottonwoods, and a cold, driving rain began to fall. Jedediah stretched his small canvas tarp over a low-hanging branch, creating a crude, sloping shelter. It wasn't much, but it kept the worst of the rain off the boys and the fire. He herded them under it, then sat at the edge of the shelter himself, taking the brunt of the wind and rain keeping his body between them and the storm. He had nothing left to offer them, no food, no more dry clothes, only his presence as a guard against the night. He fed the fire stick by stick, rationing his precious fuel, knowing it had to last until dawn. The hours crawled by. The rain drummed a ceaseless tattoo on the canvas. In the lulls between gusts of wind, the roar of the river was a constant menacing reminder of how close they had come to death. Sometime after midnight, Jedediah must have drifted off, his head slumped against his chest. He was plunged immediately into the old nightmare. He was back in the wilderness of Virginia, the air thick with the smell of blood and wet wool. He was crouched behind a fallen log, his rifle hot in his hands. A boy from his company, a farm kid from Ohio, named Billy, no older than Wamni, was lying in the mud nearby, his eyes wide with shock, his hand pressed to a terrible wound in his stomach. "Jed, help me, Jed." Billy's voice was a whisper, a child's plea, but the Confederate charge was coming, a wave of grey and steel and rebel yells, and the captain was screaming, fall back now." He had hesitated, torn between duty and the dying boy. He had fallen back. He had left Billy in the mud. He awoke with a gasp, his own voice caught in his throat. The fire had burned low, casting long skeletal shadows. The rain had softened to a drizzle. He looked at the two boys sleeping under the canvas. Wamni was curled into a ball, but Chaitan was awake. He was watching Jedediah, his dark eyes luminous in the firelight. There was no fear in his gaze now, only a quiet, somber question. He had seen the terror on Jedediah's face, heard the choked cry. He had seen the ghost that haunted the white man. Jedediah simply held his gaze for a long moment, the man and the boy, two strangers from different worlds, sharing a moment of profound, unspoken understanding in the deep, dark heart of the night. He added a few more sticks to the fire, the small act a promise against the darkness. He would not leave these boys. He would see this through. Whatever came with the dawn, he would face it. Dawn arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a slow, grey infiltration. The rain had stopped, leaving the world sodden and dripping. A thick mist rose from the river, clinging to the ground and muffling all sound. The world felt quiet, still holding its breath. Jedediah hadn't slept again. He sat sentinel, his back against a tree, the exhausted colt resting heavy on his lap. He felt a strange sense of peace, the calm that comes after a great and terrible trial. The boys were still asleep, their breathing soft and even under the blanket. They had survived the night, but the quiet was a deception. It started as a feeling more than a sound, a low rhythmic vibration in the earth, a thrumming he could feel in the soles of his feet and the base of his spine. He straightened up, every sense on high alert. The soldier in him recognized it instantly. Cavalry. A lot of it. Beatrice, his mule tethered nearby, lifted her head and gave a nervous snort, her long ears swiveling towards the east. Then the sound began to separate from the mist, a distinct and growing cadence, the muffled percussive beat of unshod hooves on wet earth. It wasn't the ordered metallic clatter of a U.S. cavalry patrol. This was something else entirely. The sound grew steadily, a rolling thunder that seemed to come from all directions. At once, a sound designed to intimidate, to overwhelm. Jedediah stood up slowly, his joints protesting. He moved to the edge of the clearing, peering into the thick grey mist. The boys began to stir, woken by the growing tremor in the ground. Chayton sat up, his eyes wide, a new kind of fear dawning on his face. He knew that sound. And then they emerged from the fog. They appeared not all at once, but in spectral pieces. The head of a painted war pony, its breath pluming in the cold air. The feathered tip of a lance. A stoic, weathered face streaked with black and red paint. They materialized from the mist like spirits, silent and menacing, fanning out to form a wide, inescapable semicircle around his meager camp. There were not 10 or 20. Jedediah's mind, trained for quick battlefield assessments, did a rough, sweeping count. It was closer to 100. 100 warriors mounted on powerful ponies, armed with a mix of bows, lances, and rifles. They were a living wall of muscle leather and grim intent. They sat perfectly still on their mounts, their collective gaze fixed on him, 100 pairs of eyes, filled with a cold, unreadable judgment. The silence that fell after the hoofbeats ceased was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with menace, and the promise of imminent violence. Jedediah felt a cold dread wash over him, colder than the river had been. This was it. This was the reckoning he had expected. They would see a white man, an intruder. They would see their missing children. They would draw only one conclusion. His act of salvation would be interpreted as an act of kidnapping of violation. He did the only thing he could. He raised his hands, slowly, palms empty and open, showing he meant no harm. He left the colt on the ground by the fire. He took a half step to his left, deliberately placing his body between the approaching warriors and the shelter where the boys were now fully awake and peering out from under the canvas, their faces pale with terror. It was a futile gesture, he knew, but it was an instinctive one. He would protect them. The sea of warriors parted, and a single rider moved forward. He was an older man, his face a road map of deep lines, his long grey-streaked hair braided with eagle feathers. He wore no paint, but he needed none. Authority radiated from him like heat from a forge. His face was a mask of granite, but his eyes, dark and sharp, betrayed a maelstrom of emotion, fear, anger, and a desperate, searching hope. He rode a magnificent black war-horse that stood its ground without a tremor. This was their leader. This was the father. The man's eyes swept the scene. He saw the pathetic camp, the dying fire, the soaked and shivering white man with the scarred face standing defensively before the tarp. And then his gaze fell upon the small faces peeking out from under the canvas. His iron composure cracked. A flicker of something profound relief, raw and overwhelming, passed across his features, so quick that Jedediah might have missed it if he hadn't been watching so intently. The father had found his sons. The chief dismounted in a single fluid motion. He walked forward, his moccasins making no sound on the wet ground. He stopped 10 feet from Jedediah, his eyes now locked on him. The 100 warriors behind him waited their silence, a coiled spring of potential violence. The fate of Jedediah Stone now rested in the hands of this one man, a man whose name he did not know, a man who had every reason in the world to kill him where he stood. The dawn was no longer grey. It was the color of blood and judgment. The air was so thick with tension it was hard to breathe. The chief's eyes, dark and piercing, bored into Jedediah, searching for something: truth, deception, weakness. Jedediah held his gaze, his heart hammering against his ribs, but his posture steady. He had faced down cannons and cavalry charges. He would not show fear now, not when these boys' testimony depended on his composure. The chief spoke, his voice low and resonant, a sound like stones grinding together. The words were Lakota sharp and demanding. Jedediah didn't understand them, but the tone was clear. Explain yourself. Now. Before Jedediah could even attempt a gesture, a second warrior dismounted and strode forward to stand beside the chief. This one was younger, his face set in hard, angry lines, his eyes burning with suspicion. He carried a Winchester rifle, and he held it with a familiarity that spoke of frequent use. He pointed a finger at Jedediah. Wasichu. The word was a venomous hiss. He spat a stream of Lakota at the chief, his gestures sharp and accusatory. He pointed at Jedediah's worn Union jacket, then at the gash on his side, then at the boys huddled under the tarp. The narrative he was weaving was obvious. This white soldier attacked them, hurt himself in the process, and stole them. Several warriors behind him murmured in agreement, their hands tightening on their weapons. The delicate balance was tipping towards violence. Jedediah's mind raced. He was one man. His pistol was on the ground. Even if he could reach it, he would be dead before he could fire a single shot. His life now depended entirely on the 2 children he had pulled from the river. As if sensing this, the older boy, Chayton, pushed the blanket aside and stood up. He walked on trembling legs to the chief's side. 8. Father. The single word cut through the tension. The chief, Matonagi Bear Spirit, turned his gaze to his son. The granite mask softened into the face of a parent consumed by worry. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his touch both a comfort and an interrogation. Chayton began to speak, his young voice, clear and earnest in the morning quiet. He spoke quickly, passionately, the words tumbling out of him. He pointed at the roaring river, then made a gesture of falling, of being swept away. He pointed to his younger brother Wamne, who had now come to stand behind him, and mimed the act of drowning of arms flailing in the water. Then, his small hand still shaking, he pointed directly at Jedediah. A low growl rumbled through the assembled warriors. The angry warrior with the Winchester took a step forward, his knuckles white on the rifle stock. But Chaitan shook his head vehemently. He mimed Jedediah plunging into the water. He made swimming motions, his arms pumping, showing a great struggle. He pointed to Jedediah's bleeding side, then to the large log stranded on the rocks in the middle of the river, making it clear the wound came from the rescue, not a fight. He described the long swim, the exhaustion, how Jedediah had carried Wamni on his back, how he had come back for him. He pointed to the fire, to the blanket wrapped around his brother, to the makeshift shelter that had protected them from the storm. As he spoke, the story of the previous night unfolded in the air between them. The warriors listened, their expressions shifting from pure hostility to confusion, and then to a grudging respect. The narrative of the angry warrior was crumbling, replaced by the unshakable truth of a child. When Chaitan finished, Wamni stepped forward and added his own small voice, his testimony confirming his brother's. He held up the tin cup Jedediah had given them the tea in a simple, powerful piece of evidence. A heavy silence descended once more. All eyes turned to Matonagi. His face was unreadable again, his inner thoughts hidden behind a lifetime of disciplined leadership. He was no longer just a father. He was the chief, and the laws of his people. The safety of his land rested on his shoulders. This man was still an intruder, a veteran of the same army that was even now encroaching on their sacred lands. A single act of kindness, however great, could not erase that. The angry warrior, whose name was Tashunka, spoke again, his voice sharp. He is still a Wasichu on our sacred land. The old laws are clear. His presence here is a trespass. His life is forfeit. Matonagi listened, his gaze distant. He looked at the river, as if seeing the events of the night before, replayed on its churning surface. He looked at his sons, their flesh warm and living, instead of cold and lost. Finally, his eyes came to rest on Jedediah Stone. He walked forward until he was standing directly in front of Jedediah. He was shorter than the white man, but his presence was immense. He looked at the scar on Jedediah's face, at the profound weariness in his pale blue eyes. He saw not a predator, but a man as broken and haunted as the land itself. "You saved my sons," Matonagi said, his voice quiet, but carrying to every man present. He spoke in surprisingly clear, if heavily accented English. "You pulled the heart of my heart from the drowning water. My blood is in your debt." Jedediah could only nod his throat, too tight to speak. "Tashunka is right." The chief continued, his voice hardening slightly. "You are on our land. By our law, this is a crime. But by the law of the Creator, a life given must be honored. The debt I owe you is greater than the law you have broken." He turned to face his warriors. "This man is not to be harmed," he declared, his voice ringing with indisputable authority. "He is under my protection. The spirit of the bear will shield him." A wave of relief, so potent it made Jedediah's knees weak, washed over him. He had survived. But as Matonagi turned back to him, Jedediah saw that the judgment was not yet over. There was a complication in the chief's eyes, a look that said this was not a simple pardon. The matter was far from settled. "A debt of life," Matonagi said, his English slow and deliberate, "is not paid with horses or blankets. It is a bond. It cannot be broken until it is repaid in kind. You have given me back my future. Now your future belongs to me until the scales are balanced." Jedediah stared at him, confused. I don't want anything. I was just passing through." Matonagi gave a slight, grim smile. "You do not get to choose. You entered our lives by way of the river. You cannot simply walk away." You are no longer a stranger, Jedediah Stone. You are now a part of our story, and your journey is no longer your own. The ghost who had come west seeking silence and solitude had just found himself bound by the strongest chain of all a debt of honor to 100 warriors and their chief. He was saved, but he was no longer free. The Lakota camp was a sprawling, living entity, nestled in a wide, protected valley, a few hours' ride from the river. It was a vibrant world of smoke-stained teepees, the smell of cooking meat, the sounds of children laughing, and the constant watchful presence of the warriors who had escorted Jedediah there. He was not a prisoner, not in the traditional sense. He was given a teepee to use food, to eat a hearty bison stew that was the best meal he'd had in a year, and his mule Beatrice was tended to. But he was watched. Every step he took was observed by a dozen pairs of eyes. He was an anomaly, a puzzle they had not yet solved. Tashunka the angry warrior made his distrust plain. He and his followers would stare openly at Jedediah, their faces hard masks of contempt. They saw only the blue of his faded jacket, the color of their enemy. They could not reconcile the man who saved the chief's sons with the specter of the U.S. Army. For 3 days, Jedediah was left mostly to himself, a period of observation and quiet deliberation for the tribe. He watched the life of the camp, the easy rhythm of a people who lived in harmony with the land. He saw mothers tanning hides, old men telling stories to wide-eyed children, hunters returning with game. It was a world away from the rigid, violent order of the army camps he had known. On the 4th morning, Matonagi sent for him. Jedediah was led to the chief's teepee, the largest in the camp, decorated with painted symbols of bears and spiritual journeys. Inside, the light was dim, the air thick with the scent of sage and sweetgrass. Matonagi sat on a pile of thick buffalo robes, his sons Chaitan and Wamni sitting quietly beside him. He gestured for Jedediah to sit. "My sons tell me you have the ghosts of war in your eyes." The chief began, skipping any preamble. "They saw it in the night, a pain that does not sleep." Jedediah was taken aback by the directness. I saw things, a long time ago. We have all seen things." Matonagi said, his voice softening slightly. "Our land bleeds from the memory of Sand Creek. My own brother fell at the Platte Bridge. The Wasichu have brought many ghosts to this land." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the small space. "When you pulled my sons from the water, you fought like a man with nothing to lose. A hollow man, a man running from his own spirit. Is this true?" Jedediah could only nod the truth of it, landing like a stone in his chest. "Yes, a hollow man cannot repay a debt of life because he does not value his own." The chief stated his logic simple and profound. "To balance the scales, you must first become whole again. The debt I owe you is not just for the lives of my sons, but for the healing of your spirit. This is how you will repay me, by letting us help you fill the emptiness inside you." This was the twist Jedediah had never seen coming. He had expected to be asked, to trade, to scout, perhaps even to fight. He had never expected to be offered a path to healing. "I don't understand," Jedediah said honestly. "You will," Matonagi replied. "You are a soldier. You understand weapons. My people are now facing a new kind of weapon, the lies of the white man's treaties, the greed for the yellow rock in our sacred hills. You know how the Wasichu think. You will teach my warriors, not how to fight like them. We know how to fight, but how to understand them. You will teach us their words, their deceptions, their way of thinking, so we are not blinded by their false promises." He leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. and in return we will teach you our ways. Our medicine man, Wanbli, will guide you. He will teach you how to quiet the ghosts, how to walk in balance with the land and with your own soul. He will help you find the spirit the war stole from you. It was an audacious, impossible proposal. He was to become a part of their world, an advisor, a student. He was to trade his knowledge of war and deceit for their knowledge of peace and spirit. And when the debt is paid, Jedediah asked, when the scales are balanced, then you will be free to go, Matonagi said. You will be free to continue your journey to nowhere. Or, he added, a knowing look in his eyes, you may find that you have finally found a place to stay. A place where a man can be whole again. Jedediah looked at the two boys, Chaitan and Twamni, who were watching him, not with fear or curiosity, but with a simple, trusting acceptance. He looked at the powerful, wise chief, who offered not a reward, but a redemption. He thought of the long, lonely road behind him, a road littered with ghosts and regret. And he thought of this strange, unforeseen path that had opened up before him. For the first time in 10 years, the hollow space inside Jedediah stone felt a flicker of something other than pain. It was a tiny, fragile spark of hope. He had come to the west, seeking an end, a quiet oblivion. Instead, in the heart of his so-called enemy's land, he had been offered a new beginning. Slowly, deliberately, Jedediah gave a single firm nod. The judgment was over. The journey had just begun. The passing of the first moon was a strange and disorienting time for Jedediah Stone. The rhythm of his life, once dictated by the solitary needs of survival and the endless forward march away from his past, was now governed by the communal pulse of the Lakota camp. He woke not to silence, but to the soft murmur of conversation from nearby tipis and the laughter of children chasing dogs through the morning mist. He was a ghost no longer. He was an object of intense, unwavering scrutiny. His days were split between two worlds, two forms of education that could not have been more opposed. In the afternoons, he would sit with Matonagi Tashunka and the other senior warriors in the council lodge. This was his duty, as the debtor, to unravel the mind of the white man for them. He was not teaching them a language. He was teaching them a philosophy of conquest they found both baffling and repellent. Using charcoal on a stretched deer hide, he would draw maps of the forts along the Platte River, explaining the concept of supply lines. An army is a snake, he explained one afternoon, his voice low. It is fearsome, but if you cut it off from its tail, the wagons with food and bullets, the head will wither and die. Tashunka, ever the skeptic, would watch with folded arms and narrowed eyes. The Wasichu fight without honor, he scoffed during one session. They do not face their enemy. They poison the water and kill the buffalo to starve our women and children. Yes, Jedediah said, his voice flat with a deep, familiar shame. They do. They call it total war. They believe that to win, you must not just defeat a warrior. You must break his spirit by destroying his home. They believe the ends justify any means. He saw the disgust on their faces, but it was Matonagi who saw the deeper value. The chief listened with a focused intensity, asking sharp, insightful questions. He wasn't just learning tactics. He was learning to see the world through his enemy's eyes, to anticipate the cruel logic of their expansion. Jedediah's lessons were a dark gift, a glimpse into the shadow of his own people, and it cost him a piece of his soul every time he gave it. His mornings, however, were spent with the tribe's medicine man, an ancient wizened man named Wanbli Gleska, the spotted eagle. Wanbli was as different from Matonagi as a gentle stream is from a thunderstorm. Where the chief was authority and action, Wanbli was stillness and perception. His face was a mask of wrinkles, but his eyes were startlingly clear, missing nothing. Wanbli did not teach in the way Jedediah understood. He would simply summon Jedediah with a quiet nod and lead him out of the bustling camp and into the sacred silence of the Pahasapa. For hours they would walk Wanbli, pointing out herbs and roots, explaining their properties, not in grand lectures, but in short, practical phrases. This for fever, this for a wound, this for a troubled sleep. He taught Jedediah to listen, not with his ears, but with his whole body, to feel the direction of the wind, to read the stories left in the tracks of a deer, to understand the silent language of the birds. He was teaching Jedediah to be present, to root his wandering, haunted mind in the living world around him. One morning, as they sat on a high ridge overlooking the vast plains, Wanbli spoke without looking at him. "The chief says you carry ghosts." The old man said, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "But a ghost is only a memory that has lost its place. You feed them by running. You must give them a place to rest." "How?" Jedediah asked, the word cracking with a decade of unspoken pain. Wanbli picked up a small stone from the ground. "This stone has been here for 1,000 seasons. It has felt the sun, the ice, the fire. It does not fight the storm. It endures it. It knows it is part of the mountain. Your memories are part of your mountain. You must stop trying to throw them off the cliff. You must learn to carry their weight." The words settled into Jedediah not as a solution, but as a new way of seeing his burden. His connection with the chief's sons, Chaitan and Wamni, became his bridge to the rest of the tribe. They would often seek him out their initial fear, replaced by a hero worship that made him deeply uncomfortable. They would show him their bows, watch him clean the parts of his colt peacemaker with a quiet fascination, and ask him questions about the world beyond the plains. In turn, they gave him an identity beyond the Wasichu. To the children of the camp he became "He who swam the serpent," a title that slowly began to chip away at the hostility of their parents. One evening, a scout returned with a copy of a new proclamation from the fort written on paper from the government. The Lakota could read some English, but the language was dense, filled with legal terms designed to confuse. Matonagi brought it to Jedediah. Jedediah read it by the firelight, his face grim. "It says they will give you cattle and supplies if you agree to let their prospectors search for gold in the low hills." He pointed to a specific line. "But this part here, the undersigned relinquish all claims to subsurface mineral rights. They are trying to trick you. They know the real gold is deeper. They will give you a few cows for the right to take the heart of the Pahasapa. They are buying the mountain for the price of a handful of beads." A dangerous silence fell over the council lodge. Tashunka stared at Jedediah, and for the first time, the open hostility in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of grudging respect. He did not like this white man, but the truth of his words was undeniable. The shadow Jedediah carried was now their shield. Later that night, Jedediah stood at the edge of the camp, looking out at the vast, star-dusted sky. The ghosts were still there, whispering at the edge of his hearing. Billy's face still swam in his memory, but for the first time, their voices were not the only thing he could hear. He could also hear the gentle wisdom of Wanbli, the trusting laughter of the chief's sons, and the steady beating heart of the community that had, against all odds, taken him in. The hollowness within him was not gone, but it no longer felt like an endless void. It felt like a space that was slowly, painstakingly being filled. And so the story of Jedediah Stone, the poor stranger, didn't end at the riverbank with a simple thank you. It began there. His solitary path was diverted by a single selfless act, plunging him into the heart of the Lakota nation, not as an enemy, but as a paradox, an outsider who held a sacred debt. His journey was no longer about escaping his past, but about building a future he never could have imagined. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest rewards we receive aren't for us, but for the person we have the chance to become. Our choices, especially the ones made in a split second when everything is on the line, have the power to rewrite our entire destiny. If this story of courage, honor, and unexpected redemption moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a tale of the true complex spirit of the Old West. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Your support helps us keep these incredible histories alive. Thank you for listening.